Hello and welcome to another discussion in the series regarding mergers and acquisitions, which is being presented by the San Diego corporate law firm of George P. Shenas, Incorporated. I'm George Shenas, and today it's my privilege to be joined by two gentlemen who I've been involved with for some time, who happen to each be chief executive officers of their latest company and also with respect to a number of companies that have preceded that have been involved on either the buy side or the sell side of M&A, merger and acquisition transactions. Gary Gist, to my right, is the chairman of a company which has recently concluded its activities called Palomar Companies. That company was the holding company for 5 business units that were acquired from Hughes Aircraft in 1995. Gary is now the chairman of the board of Intersil Corporation, which is a NASDAQ company involved in technology products. Bob Brindle, to the left, is the outgoing president of T-Systems International, which is a company that has recently been sold in the latter part of 2008 to the John Deere Corporation. Bob's experience also involves being a CEO and an owner in some instances of companies that have principally been on the sell side of M&A transactions. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you, George.
Both of you have played a role in building and managing your team, if you will, your M&A team. Can you talk a little bit about how you go about that, who's on the team, and how you manage the information that flows from that team? Bob?
Our experience has been a core management group is invaluable in providing the maximum return to the seller. So we involve a core management group that's really necessary and required to be able to complete the sale. That group can be 3 or 4 people, or it could go down to 8 or 12, depending on the size of the organization and the group and the global reach. But in any event, there needs to be some participation on the part of the group, and whether that's a management carve-out or whether that's retention bonuses. But we found that this makes them part of the participation in the process, and also makes them part of the participation in the liquidity. So the aspect of the communication is never in doubt, because you're dealing with this group, this inner core group that's making it happen.
Now, Gary, I know that and in this process, you like to maintain confidentiality, as I understand your approach.
Right. We've seen cases where, when it's not confidential, where you wind up getting the customer involved, and then you're starting to run some risk to impact your ongoing business during the due diligence process, which could ultimately affect the sale price.
Gary, I know in the Palomar organization, that company was in effect kind of a transitional holding company, so to speak. You had Citicorp as the financial partner, and the ultimate intent, and everyone well knew it, was to hold these companies for a while, grow them, and then resell them at a profit. And a number of your executives had equity interests in the venture, the management share. Did that change or did that affect the approach that you used in terms of maintaining confidentiality during the process of putting the company on the market?
We have actually had sort of the opposite experience because of the kinds of companies we owned. When we approached our competitors about potential sales of these companies, we basically were informing the whole industry the companies for sale. Now, I know it's supposed to be a confidential process and you have non-disclosure agreements, but the reality is everyone finds out. And that was the experience that we had with all of our companies. As we sold them, then there was a fairly broad-based knowledge out there that these companies were for sale. So that's where the beginning hypothesis of sort of what we were looking at here. And we also had a group of CEOs, we were presidents actually, who ran these companies. And sometimes the CEOs were going to go with the company, and in one case, the CEO was going to retire. So in that case, the retiring CEO wasn't even part of the process, because if he'd become part of the process, he probably wouldn't have been able to retire, and that's not what he wanted. So we actually took him out. He actually never appeared before the buyers. And I substituted in that case, and we just went forward from there. Now, in terms of keeping it open, we found that it's a process of opening slowly the knowledge base wider and wider and wider. And eventually what happens is, as a buyer starts to meet more people and get further and further and further down the organization, they become almost part of the company. And I've actually seen situations where buyers justified things that changed or something happened. They could understand why it happened because they were so far down in talking to the people, and they believed what the people were telling them. It also gives the people who work for you today and will work for the buyer tomorrow a chance to meet the new buyers. And that goes a long way towards building trust and a relationship that allows the company to go forward.
A lot of cases, they start off saying the buyer to the seller, you, and as the thing progresses, it becomes a we.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I've seen that happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We also had another unique thing in that there was a group of individuals who were part of the management team, and they obviously had equity in the companies. But we also made sure that every single person in the company received compensation out of the sales proceeds.
This is very similar to what you were talking about, Bob. Yeah.
And that helped a lot in two ways. It gets people on board. They see they're getting something out of it. Maybe they'd like to get a little more, but that's neither here nor there. But it helped them deal with the process, because it is a change process for them. And it helps them deal with that process and feel that they were fairly treated. It also is impressive to the buyer, because the buyer now has a bunch of happy employees. And the happy employees make that buyer feel really good about where they're going, and they can move forward without worrying about what's happened in the past.
And to be somewhat devious about it, it also creates goodwill with your employees who are transitioning over to the buyer, so that when issues perhaps arise after the closing that could result in liability from the seller to the new
they're worked
buyer,
out.
you have allies on the other side rather than enemies feeding negative information to the buyer.
No, exactly. And we've always had situations where a buyer keeps an escrow, and we make sure that everybody who had equity is part of that escrow, so that as we go forward 18 months or 2 years after we made the sale, some of the people who still work for the company are going to get part of that escrow back to them.
Yeah.
So now they have a vested interest in making sure that things run smoothly.
Exactly. Okay, so we work our way then downstream, and as this deal evolves, questions arise, values start to erode, potentially the price starts to drop. And let's assume you're a CEO, but you are not the owner, not a principal owner. How do you deal with that issue, and how do you communicate and maintain objectivity when you're communicating with your principal owner or with your shareholders in a situation like that?
Well, I think that what you have to be able to do is provide support to your owner to give him the information or the positioning that he would need to allow him to negotiate from a position of strength. And whether that's industry information or getting more competitors involved in the process, I think that your job is to really provide that structure to the owner to allow him to maximize whatever is in the deal.
You faced this situation again?
We really haven't faced that situation. I think it goes back to the things I talked about in the beginning about making sure that what you tell a buyer comes true. And if you see problems out 3-4 months from now, 5 months from now, you need to communicate those. Because it's, no matter what you think, if you try to sell something to someone with a set of assumptions and things go really bad later on, they're going to come back and talk to you about that. Now, they may come back informally and talk to you about it and want money back, or they may come back to you formally through the legal process and want their money back. So you don't really kid anybody in this industry, and people who think that they do, you know, I think are really being very, very short-sighted. You're much better off if you just are upfront about the issues and what you're looking for, and you can get a good seller and you can have a real sale, not a sale that's going to come back a year from now and bite you. And I think a good example was when Raytheon went back on Hughes, and they asked for some of their money back. So it happens in small deals and it happens in big deals.
Many times there's a misperception on the part of the buyer in terms of some specifics, nuances to the business, that the CEO needs to support ownership with the correct analysis so that they can rectify that misperception.
It goes back to the trust thing, and we didn't touch on that earlier. I think that the number one job of the CEO with a seller, and from my view with the buyer, as seller or the buyer, is to establish a trust relationship between yourself and whoever's buying the company, or whoever you're buying the company from, either one. You have to develop that trust, and if you can't develop it, that's going to lead to issues later on. I mean, it's going to be difficult trying to negotiate the sale agreement. It's going to be difficult trying to do the T's and C's. It's going to be difficult trying to get it closed. It just creates difficulty. So you have to develop that trust. And once you develop that, I think that's what takes you forward through the deal, because no matter what, it's a deal between two people.
And that trust step is the first step to the integration process being successful.
Yeah.
And that's the principal job of the CEO in this whole continuum of the negotiating process. You have to establish that with the right people on the other side. And in some articles I've written from a lawyer's perspective, the very same thing goes on between the seller's lawyer and the buyer's lawyer.
Right.
They have to be able to rely on what I am telling them, and that it's credible and can be taken to the bank. Without that, you are headed for real difficulties in the negotiating process. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, George.
It's nice to get input from the CEO's perspective. We've been talking to other professionals during this series, and this is an invaluable point of view. Thank you both. I also want to thank our viewing audience for joining us today. I hope that you've gained as much information as knowledge as I have during this process. Thank you for joining us.